She was the kind of teacher students remembered long after graduation, organized, energetic, and quietly devoted to the people around her. At 41 years old, she had spent nearly 2 decades teaching literature at the local high school. To colleagues, she was dependable, the type who covered classes for younger teachers or stayed late grading papers. To her family, she was the steady anchor, always awake before sunrise, always keeping routines intact. And one of those routines was her morning jog. She ran the same neighborhood loop every weekday, rain or shine, before heading to school. It was her quiet time, the half hour where she could clear her head before stepping into the chaos of classrooms. On an ordinary Wednesday in late March, she woke around 5:30, just as she always did. Her husband, still in bed, heard the faint sounds of the kitchen coffee maker and the soft shuffle of running shoes against the tile floor. She left her phone plugged into the charger by the counter, grabbed her keys, and slipped outside. It was still dim with the last of night, though the neighborhood was beginning to stir with commuters and porch lights. She wore her usual jogging clothes, a lightweight jacket against the cool air, and set off on her familiar route. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual. Several neighbors later recalled seeing her. A woman watering her front porch plants before work remembered the quick rhythm of footsteps passing by. Another resident, out with his dog, saw her jog across the intersection near the small park entrance, waving politely as she passed. To them, it looked like any other morning, routine, unremarkable, even comforting in its predictability. But somewhere between that park entrance and her planned return home, something happened, and from that moment on, she simply ceased to be seen. By 7 o'clock, her husband began to notice the time. Normally, she was back by then, showered and preparing for the day. At first, he assumed she had extended her run slightly or stopped to chat with a neighbor. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew. He checked the driveway. Her car still sat there. He called her cell phone. No answer. The device still plugged in inside the kitchen. At 7:30, the reality struck. She should have been home. She should have been preparing for work. Instead, there was only silence. Calls began to circulate. Her husband phoned the school to say she might be running late. Colleagues expected her, but she never appeared. A friend she sometimes carpooled with called back to check in, concerned. Within hours, the network of people who relied on her daily steadiness realized the same terrifying truth. She was gone. When her husband officially contacted police, the first question was the usual one. Was there a chance she had left voluntarily? Arguments at home, financial pressures, secret struggles. Detectives always began with the possibility, however slim, that an adult disappearance could be a choice. But those who knew her rejected it immediately. She had no reason to abandon her life, no pattern of risk and no history of instability. Her morning routine was sacred to her, her students depended on her, and her phone and car had been left untouched. Nothing about it fit the idea of someone running away. By late morning, concern had spread through the neighborhood. Parents waiting at bus stops whispered about the teacher who never came home. Friends began knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her after the park. Social media posts circulated, attaching her smiling faculty photo to frantic messages, begging for information. A woman jogging in daylight in a safe suburban community had vanished in a matter of minutes. It didn't make sense, and that made it even more terrifying. Her husband and family retraced her jogging route, walking the sidewalks she normally followed, calling out her name. They stopped joggers and dog walkers along the way, asking if anyone remembered passing her. A few confirmed seeing her at the park entrance, but nothing beyond that. The trail she usually took into the woods curved just out of sight from the street. Somewhere along that line, the clues evaporated. By early afternoon, police had arrived at the house to gather details. They confirmed the small things. Her wallet was still in her purse, her phone remained charging, her morning coffee sat half-finished on the counter. All signs suggested she intended to return within the hour, just as she always did. That evidence, combined with neighbors' accounts, pointed toward something sudden, something that happened in the small window of her run. As the day slipped into evening, what began as concern hardened into dread. Patrol cars circled the neighborhood. Officers walked the edge of the wooded trail with flashlights. Word spread fast, and within hours, dozens of volunteers gathered to help search. Her absence was not just unusual, it was impossible to explain. She had walked out her front door for the simplest of routines, and then she never returned. When the sun fell and her home stood dark without her, the fear became undeniable. This wasn't a late arrival, or a miscommunication, or a sudden decision to take time away. Something had happened on that jog. Something that left her car untouched, her phone charging, and her family waiting in disbelief. And for investigators, the next step was clear. They would have to search the woods. By the time police arrived at the wooded trail, the sense of urgency was already spreading like wildfire. They marked her home as the last confirmed place she had been, then began mapping her running route with precision. Officers moved quickly, requesting search and rescue units, K-9 handlers, and even a helicopter to assist. For a missing child, this kind of mobilization was common. For an adult, it was rare. But the fact that she vanished in daylight in a neighborhood full of witnesses pushed authorities to act as if every second counted. Neighbors watched as uniformed officers taped off sections of the park entrance. They swept the path with flashlights, though the afternoon light still poured through the trees. The wooded trail was quiet, only the crunch of boots and the distant sound of a helicopter breaking the silence. It was the same trail joggers used daily, a place considered safe. And now, it was a crime scene. By evening, dozens of volunteers had joined the search. Parents, students, church members, and strangers combed the park with growing desperation. They moved in lines, shoulder to shoulder, pushing through undergrowth, calling her name again and again. Some searched creeks and drainage ditches, while others focused on small clearings where joggers sometimes stretched or rested. A nearby lake was dragged by divers, the water black and cold, but nothing surfaced. Cadaver dogs were brought to the forest edge. Handlers gave the order, and the animals pressed their noses to the ground, pulling toward the deeper woods. At first, there was hope. They seemed to pick up her trail, pulling urgently in one direction. But after only a few hundred yards, the dogs stopped. The scent ended abruptly, as though it had been cut off. Handlers circled back, reintroduced the scent with a piece of her clothing, and tried again. The result was the same. A faint trail, then nothing. Investigators were baffled. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Detectives considered the possibility of abduction. If someone had forced her into a vehicle along the wooded path, it might explain the sudden loss of scent. But there were no tire marks on the dirt, no disturbed soil, no drag marks. Every inch of ground was studied, and still no signs of struggle emerged. No torn clothing, no dropped belongings, not even footprints distinguishable from the dozens of volunteers searching. The trail yielded nothing. That first night, her husband stood at the edge of the taped-off area, waiting, hoping, refusing to leave. His voice broke as he called out her name into the darkness, clinging to the thought that she might still answer back. He gave police everything they asked for: recent photographs, dental records, her daily schedule. By midnight, her case was officially categorized as a missing person under suspicious circumstances. For law enforcement, that meant they were now treating every hour as critical. The following morning, local news outlets picked up the story. Her photograph appeared on every broadcast, her faculty portrait smiling in front of a neutral background, paired with urgent captions: "Teacher missing on jog, community in shock." Her colleagues from the high school gathered at the trail entrance, some in tears, others numb, all of them waiting for updates. Students she had mentored in drama club held up hand-drawn posters, her name written in block letters beside "Please for help." Police expanded the etched search zone. The helicopter swept over miles of fields and back roads. Thermal imaging equipment was used to detect heat signatures in the woods, but the screens showed only deer and small wildlife. Drones flew over the area, capturing aerial views of terrain too dense for foot searches. Dive teams continued to scan bodies of water within a 5-mile radius, dragging the depths in silence. Still, no sign of her emerged. Each day the search grew, but so did the weight of silence. Detectives pressed into neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking for home security footage, interviewing joggers who had been on the trail that morning. One by one, the stories repeated the same thing. They saw her pass, heading into the woods, and then she was gone. No one remembered hearing a scream. No one saw a chase. It was as though she had stepped into a part of the trail and simply never come out. By the end of the first week, authorities admitted the search was yielding no physical evidence, no torn shoe, no discarded jacket, no clue at all to suggest where she went or what happened. That void, the absence of struggle, the absence of answers, made her disappearance even more unsettling. Most missing joggers leave behind a trail, a phone ping, a dropped headphone, some trace of resistance. But here, there was nothing. Her family appeared on local news, their voices trembling, begging for information. Her husband pleaded directly into the camera, saying if anyone had seen her even for a moment, to please call the police. Her parents, their faces drawn with shock, clutched each other's hands as they begged for their daughter to come home. The community gathered for vigils, candles flickering in the night, students crying openly as teachers tried to comfort them. In less than 48 hours, the life of a respected teacher, a familiar face in classrooms and grocery store aisles, had become the center of a mystery. A woman who followed the same path every morning was suddenly missing without explanation. Investigators stood at the forest edge, with maps, dogs, and equipment, but no answers. And as the search widened and days slipped by, one question became inescapable. How could someone disappear in broad daylight on a trail filled with witnesses without leaving behind a single clue? When the search offered no answers, detectives shifted their focus to the people who had known her best. In cases like this, they often said the same thing. Strangers rarely make someone vanish in broad daylight. More often, it was someone close, someone familiar, someone who could approach without raising alarm. And so, the circle began with her husband. He sat through hours of questioning, weary and pale from sleepless nights. Investigators asked the difficult, methodical questions about their marriage, finances, routines, and arguments. He admitted they had normal disagreements, but nothing beyond the ordinary strain of work and bills. They pressed on. She seemed distant. Had she ever spoken of leaving? Did he know of anyone who might have wanted to harm her? He denied it all, his voice shaking, his eyes hollow. He was given a polygraph, the machine tracing every response. The results came back inconclusive. Not lies, but not the solid reassurance detectives were hoping for. Suspicion lingered, even if there was nothing concrete to hold him on. The family dynamic was dissected piece by piece. Friends described him as devoted, though sometimes quiet and detached compared to her outgoing warmth. Some said the marriage seemed steady. Others hinted at tension that had surfaced in the months before she vanished. Detectives logged it all, aware that perception often blurred into rumor. Without hard evidence, the line between fact and speculation grew thin. Attention soon turned to her workplace. At the high school, her colleagues were shaken but cooperative. Administrators unlocked her desk and office, hoping investigators would find something, a journal, a note, a clue tucked between lesson plans. But her files held nothing unusual. Students spoke of her kindness, her attention to their struggles, the way she stayed after school to help those who felt left behind. They painted a picture of someone steady and compassionate, someone with no reason to disappear. Yet, in the quiet corners of the faculty lounge, whispers began. One colleague admitted reluctantly that in the weeks before her disappearance, she had confided in hushed tones about something unsettling. She had the sense she was being followed, not every day, not everywhere, but often enough to leave her uneasy. A car idling near the school parking lot. A man walking behind her a little too long during her runs. She brushed it off as paranoia at first, but her words suggested real fear. Detectives leaned in on this detail, pressing the colleague for more, but she had little else to give. There were no descriptions, no license plates, no concrete incidents. Just a feeling that her friend had been watched and perhaps targeted. The rumor spread quickly. Some parents recalled her mentioning the same unease during parent-teacher nights. Students whispered in hallways about a stranger she had warned them to avoid near the school grounds. The town, already shaken by her disappearance, grew restless. Was there someone in their midst who had been waiting for her moment of vulnerability? Or was this another fragment of speculation amplified by grief? Investigators dug deeper. They subpoenaed her phone and email records, searching for secret conversations or hidden relationships. They examined her financial accounts, looking for irregular spending, debts, or sudden withdrawals. But everything was ordinary. No mysterious calls, no unexplained bank activity, no trail of deception. Her life, at least on paper, was steady and routine. Her husband remained under quiet scrutiny. Detectives revisited his alibi, interviewing co-workers at his job who confirmed he had clocked in on time the morning she vanished. Security cameras placed him at the office during the critical window when she disappeared. The alibi held, frustrating investigators who wanted answers. Without signs of struggle, without a body, and with a husband accounted for, the case grew stranger by the day. Still, suspicion clung to those closest to her. Detectives questioned her siblings, parents, and closest friends, probing for buried conflicts or long-forgotten grudges. None surfaced. Instead, they encountered only disbelief that someone so dependable could vanish while living such an ordinary life. At the school, her absence became unbearable. Students wept openly in classrooms, staring at her empty desk. Teachers whispered about her confession of being followed, wondering if they had dismissed something they should have reported. Her husband, meanwhile, was shadowed everywhere he went. Some in the community saw him as a grieving spouse. Others eyed him with suspicion, believing he knew more than he admitted. Polygraphs extended to others as well, co-workers, friends, even one student who had grown unusually close to her. All returned either clean or inconclusive. No one showed the unmistakable signs of deception investigators needed. Every lead dissolved into fog. By the end of the second week, detectives found themselves in the same position as before. No crime scene, no suspect, no motive, just fragments of rumor, marital strain, the feeling of being followed, the faint suggestion of secrets too vague to pin down. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was an unshakable unease. If her husband was telling the truth, if her colleagues were innocent, if her students had nothing to hide, then who had been watching her? Who had stepped into her routine and erased her so cleanly from the trail? The absence of evidence was its own kind of evidence, proof that whoever had done this, if anyone had, knew how to leave nothing behind. And as investigators stepped back from the first round of interviews, they faced a chilling possibility. The answers they were searching for might not be close to home at all. As the days turned into weeks, the disappearance of the high school teacher no longer belonged only to her family or her town. It had become a headline, a case carried by regional news and eventually national coverage. Her photograph appeared on news tickers, her name repeated by anchors as though she were now part of a larger narrative of unexplained vanishings. And with that attention came something else: theories. Some of the earliest centered on the idea of a random abduction. It was the explanation that felt most plausible to many in the community. A woman jogging alone near a wooded path, vulnerable for just long enough for someone to act. Perhaps a predator had been watching, waiting for the right morning. The possibility that a stranger could appear out of nowhere and erase her in broad daylight shook the sense of safety the town once held. Parents who had let their children roam the park now pulled them back, warning them never to walk alone. Every unfamiliar face was scrutinized, every unfamiliar car reported. But others were less convinced. They pointed to her phone left behind, her wallet untouched, her routine broken in a way that suggested choice rather than force. Online forums, fueled by speculation, grew louder with another theory, that she had staged her disappearance. Some insisted she'd been overwhelmed, perhaps suffocated by responsibilities and expectations. Anonymous posters claimed no one truly knew the private life behind her public image. They hinted at hidden debts, strained relationships, or even a double life. In the absence of answers, these claims spread quickly, each retelling bending the truth a little more. The rumors soon sharpened into darker suggestions. Some began whispering that she'd been involved in an affair, that perhaps guilt or fear had driven her to vanish voluntarily. Others speculated that the affair itself could have led to foul play, someone jealous, someone betrayed. Detectives looked into every lead, every name whispered through the grapevine, but each search returned nothing. Her accounts showed no financial strain. Her communications revealed no hidden relationships. Yet the rumors persisted, filling the silence left by the lack of evidence. Detectives themselves were not immune to chasing shadows. In the second week of the investigation, reports came in about a truck spotted near the jogging trail. Witnesses described it as dark-colored, parked along the roadside at unusual hours. It matched the description of a vehicle seen in other parts of the county where women had reported being followed. The lead looked promising, and for a brief time, investigators poured resources into finding the truck. But when they did, its owner was ruled out, a contractor with verifiable work records that placed him in the area. Another path that led nowhere. Another tip came from a woman walking her dog on the morning of the disappearance. She swore she heard a scream in the distance, muffled and short, just as the sun was rising. Search teams returned to the woods, combing the area once more, hoping they had missed something. For 2 days they covered ground that had already been scoured, but they found nothing. Investigators began to doubt the report. Sound carried strangely in the woods, and the woman herself admitted she could not be certain of what she had heard. It became another entry in the growing list of possibilities that could not be proved. Meanwhile, the online conversation only intensified. Armchair detectives dissected her jogging route, timing the minutes between sightings, drawing maps that tried to account for every second of her morning. Some claimed she'd been taken by someone she knew. Others were convinced a serial predator was to blame. A few even spun elaborate theories about organized crime, suggesting she had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. None of it had evidence, but the speculation filled forums and comment sections until her story was less about her life and more about the mystery of her absence. For her family, the rumors were unbearable. Each theory was like a new wound, each headline a reminder that strangers were rewriting her story without knowing her. Her husband's grief was complicated by suspicion, her parents' sorrow compounded by whispers of betrayal or scandal. They begged the public to focus on finding her, not on tearing apart her memory. But in the absence of real answers, people clung to stories that made sense to them, however far from the truth they might be. Detectives pressed on, determined to keep the investigation grounded in fact. They followed every credible lead, subpoenaed phone records, reviewed security footage from miles of roadways, and checked in with known offenders in the area. But no pattern emerged, no trail led to her. What began as a straightforward missing person case had twisted into a maze of speculation and dead ends. Weeks had now passed since she vanished, and the theories only multiplied while the facts remained scarce. Every false lead drained resources, every rumor pulled attention from what little evidence existed. And yet, detectives knew they could not stop. If she had been taken, she might still be alive. If she had walked away, she might still be found. But with each day that ended in silence, the possibility of answers seemed to shrink. And in the quiet of that uncertainty, the case shifted from an active search into something heavier, a story that was beginning to haunt the town, a mystery that was no longer just about where she had gone, but whether the truth would ever be known. As the weeks dragged into months, the shock of her disappearance hardened into something quieter, something heavier. The missing posters that once clung fresh to telephone poles began to fade under the sun, their colors washed to a pale ghost of her smiling face. Rain streaked the ink until her features blurred, yet the posters remained, taped and stapled by those who refused to let her memory vanish. In grocery store windows, at the entrance of the school where she had taught, and on the doors of local businesses, her face looked back at people every day, a reminder that she had left without explanation and had yet to return. Every anniversary of her disappearance brought candlelight vigils. The first year, the turnout was overwhelming. Hundreds of students, parents, and neighbors gathered at the edge of the trail where she was last seen. Candles flickered in the evening air as her family stood in silence, their grief visible in the slump of their shoulders and the strain in their voices. Her colleagues from the school read poems her students had written in her honor. Children clutched letters they had written to her, notes full of stories and gratitude, some still addressed to "Dear Teacher," as if she might read them. The letters were tied to balloons and released into the night sky, drifting upward until they disappeared. The years that followed, the vigils grew smaller, but they never stopped. Each time, the same questions were asked. How could a woman vanish on her morning run in a neighborhood full of witnesses and leave no trace? How could there be no answers after so much searching? Each year the candles were lit, the silence broken by prayers, and the town was reminded of its wound. For her family, the silence was unbearable. At first, they clung to hope, checking every phone call, every tip that came through. They met with detectives weekly, sometimes daily, desperate for updates. But as months turned into years, their lives grew heavier. Bills piled up. Her absence left more than grief. It left a financial vacuum. She had been a steady provider, her salary crucial to their household. Without it, her husband struggled. He returned to work quickly, but his performance slipped. Friends described him as withdrawn, a man hollowed by a loss too large to process. He stopped attending vigils after the third year. At first, people assumed it was too painful for him. Then, whispers began. Some said his reclusiveness meant guilt. Others argued it was grief, nothing more. Neighbors watched as his once well-kept home fell into disrepair, the lawn overgrown, windows dark at night. Where once the house had been warm and lively, it now stood as a shadow of what it had been, a physical reminder of how loss could hollow a place. Her parents, meanwhile, carried their grief publicly. They continued to speak at events, to lobby police for answers, to appear on local news when reporters revisited the case. But even they admitted in quiet moments that they no longer knew what to believe. They wanted to hope she was alive, but each year without evidence drained that hope a little more. The school where she had worked tried to preserve her memory. Students painted a mural in her honor on one wall, her figure surrounded by books and flowers. Each spring, the literature department hosted a writing contest in her name, the winning essays read aloud in the auditorium she once stood in. But for the students who had known her, her empty desk in the classroom remained a sharper reminder. They still spoke of her casually, as if she might walk back through the door any day. Over time, the town itself began to change. The trail where she had vanished, once a favorite jogging spot, grew eerily quiet. People stopped running there alone. Parents warned children to avoid it. Joggers took alternate routes, unwilling to risk stepping into the same stretch of woods where she had last been seen. Locals whispered that the trail was cursed, a place marked forever by what had happened. For newcomers who asked, the story was told with hushed voices, passed down like a cautionary tale. Rumors still clung to her absence. Some swore she had left on her own, living a secret life far from the small town. Others insisted she had been taken and that her body lay hidden in the woods, beyond where the search had reached. A few even said the woods themselves held something darker, something no one wanted to face directly. None of it could be proved, but all of it kept the story alive. 6 years may have passed, but her face was still there, on posters, on murals, in the memories of those who loved her. The town had changed because of her absence. Lives had shifted, routines had been altered, and the sense of safety once taken for granted had been broken. People no longer spoke of if she would return, but quietly wondered if the mystery would ever be solved at all. And as the years stretched on, the silence of the trail only grew heavier, as though the woods themselves were keeping a secret no one could uncover. By the third year, the investigation no longer carried the same urgency it once did. In the beginning, search parties had fanned out across fields and forests. Helicopters had hovered overhead. Every day brought new interviews, new tips, new theories to chase. But as time wore on, and none of those paths produced answers, the energy drained away. The case, once a top priority, slipped quietly into the category detectives dreaded most: cold. The decision was never announced formally, but the signs were clear. The command posts at the park entrance were dismantled. The teams of volunteers stopped gathering each weekend. Detectives who had once spent long nights on her file were reassigned to new cases. The weight of her disappearance didn't lessen, but the resources devoted to solving it did. In staff meetings, her name still came up, but only briefly, another box to tick on a long list of open files. For her family, that silence felt like betrayal. They had poured everything into keeping her story alive: press conferences, vigils, interviews, but still they watched as law enforcement turned away. Her husband attended meetings at the station, listening as detectives spoke in careful tones about limited manpower, about the hundreds of other cases that demanded attention. He argued, pleaded, even begged, but the answer was always the same. Without new evidence, there was nowhere else to go. Privately, detectives admitted the frustration. They had never seen a disappearance so clean, so devoid of evidence. The case defied the usual patterns. Most missing joggers left behind traces, footprints, dropped phones, signs of resistance. But she had left nothing. Her keys had been on the kitchen counter, her car untouched in the driveway, her phone still charging by the wall. The only thing missing was her and the shoes on her feet. That detail gnawed at them. She hadn't gone far. She couldn't have. And yet, she had vanished. Cold cases don't simply fade, they linger. Investigators found themselves returning to her, file during late shifts, flipping through notes already memorized. The photographs were familiar: her smiling portrait, the park trail, the aerial maps marked with red circles. They studied them again and again, convinced that some detail had been overlooked. One detective admitted he couldn't shake the image of her half-finished coffee cup sitting on the kitchen counter when they first entered her home. It spoke of a morning interrupted, a life severed mid-routine. And yet, even that detail gave no path forward. Theories still came in from the public, but most were recycled rumors, old suspicions with no proof. A handful of psychics reached out, claiming visions of where her body lay. Police humored none of them. Journalists occasionally revisited the story, hoping to reignite interest, but with each passing year the articles grew shorter, buried deeper in the paper. She was still remembered, but now her story lived in the same space as dozens of other unsolved mysteries, tragic, haunting, but stagnant. Her parents felt the shift most painfully. In the first year, detectives had called them weekly with updates. By the fourth, those calls came rarely, if at all. They learned of developments, or rather, the lack of them, only when they pressed for meetings. Her mother carried a notebook filled with questions she asked at every appointment, hoping one day an answer might change. But the pages remained full of the same scribbles, the same frustrations: no body, no suspect, no evidence. Her husband retreated further into isolation. Once cooperative and vocal, he grew tired of repeating the same details, tired of reliving the same morning again and again. He stopped answering reporters' calls, stopped attending vigils, stopped speaking publicly at all. To some, his silence was suspicious. To others, it was simply the exhaustion of a man who had lost his wife and found nothing in return. The case file sat thick in the department archives, marked inactive. But even as resources dwindled, a few detectives couldn't let it go. They spoke of her often, late at night in the station halls, shaking their heads at the impossibility of it. How could a woman disappear while wearing running shoes on a familiar trail, leave no trace, and never be seen again? It wasn't just a mystery. It was an insult to their training, a riddle that refused to be solved. Each year on the anniversary, they revisited the file, hoping something new might stand out. Each year, it remained the same: maps, interviews, polygraph results, the same unanswered questions. They knew what the statistics said, that the longer a case remained unsolved, the less likely it was ever to be resolved. They knew she was slipping into the category of those who might never be found. And still, something kept the file alive. The smallest details refused to let go: her keys and phone untouched in the house, the shoes last seen on her feet, the absence of any other clue. Those details gnawed not just at detectives, but at the entire town. For the people who had lived alongside her, the trail still held a weight. Every time someone passed its entrance, they were reminded of her absence. And though police no longer searched its woods, The silence there spoke louder than ever. It was a silence that said the story was unfinished, a silence that suggested answers might still be buried beneath the leaves. 6 years after she vanished, the case had all but slipped into legend. New students at the high school only knew her name from the mural on the wall or from whispered retellings by older classmates. The trail where she was last seen had grown over with weeds and silence. For most, the story was frozen, an unsolved wound that had long since scarred over. And then, one ordinary morning in early autumn, the silence broke. A forestry crew was working several miles deeper into the woods than most people ever ventured. Their task was routine: clearing brush, trimming trees near an old fire break that had been left untended for years. It was dense, wild land, tangled with brambles and fallen limbs. No trails ran through it, no hikers ventured there. As one worker hacked through thick undergrowth, his blade struck something that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was a buried log, but as he brushed away soil and leaves, his stomach tightened. It wasn't wood. It was fabric. He called for the others, and together they unearthed what time had nearly hidden: a pair of running shoes, still laced, faded, weathered, but unmistakably intact. The kind of shoes you'd expect to find on a jogger. They were partially buried under years of fallen branches, as though the forest itself had tried to swallow them whole. Just a few feet away, one of the workers noticed something pale against the dark soil. He crouched, brushed it clean, and froze. It was bone. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant buzz of machinery. They knew instantly what they had found. This wasn't just debris. This was a human being. The crew called authorities, their voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might disturb what lay beneath. Within hours, the woods were alive again with law enforcement. The area was cordoned off, investigators weaving carefully through the brush. Crime scene tape fluttered against branches as forensic teams marked the ground with bright flags. Piece by piece, they began to uncover what the forest had kept hidden for so long. The skeletal remains were scattered but largely preserved by the soil and shade. Bits of clothing clung to the bones, fabric faded to the color of earth, but still recognizable as running attire. The shoes, still bound with their original laces, seemed to whisper of the morning she left home and never returned. Nearby, a watch was found, its face cracked but intact. Even after 6 years, the personal items told a clear story. This was the missing teacher. The discovery stunned investigators. They had searched these woods countless times before, but never here. The location was miles from the marked trail, a place no one had believed she could have reached on foot. It was steep, uneven terrain, choked with thorns and fallen trees. In the early days, the search had focused on accessible paths, on areas where joggers typically strayed. This spot had been dismissed, considered too remote, too unlikely. And yet, here she was. Detectives who had worked the original case stood in silence at the scene, grappling with the reality of what they were seeing. For years, they had been haunted by the absence of evidence, the impossibility of her disappearance. Now, after so much time, they finally had proof that she had been there all along. The forest, indifferent and vast, had kept her secret until chance work had uncovered it. News of the discovery spread quickly. Families of missing persons always speak of the cruel duality of such moments: relief at finding their loved one and devastation at what that confirmation means. For her parents, the phone call from detectives shattered the fragile hope they had carried. Their daughter was no longer missing. She was gone, and had been for years. For her husband, who had withdrawn into near silence, the news was both an end and a new beginning of grief. The town reacted with shock. Vigils were held again, this time with a different tone. The candles lit were no longer just for hope, but for mourning. Her former students, now older, gathered at the mural in the school hallway, touching her painted likeness with their hands as if to reach across the years. Neighbors whispered about how close she had been all along, hidden in woods that bordered their own backyards. The sense of safety that had cracked when she vanished splintered again. For investigators, the discovery reopened every question they had once asked. How had she ended up so far off the trail? Had she wandered there on her own, disoriented or injured, Or had someone forced her into the dense woods where no one would think to look? The shoes, the clothing, the scattered bones, they provided answers but also raised new doubts. The forest had finally given something back, but not the clarity anyone hoped for. Instead, it offered a grim reminder. Even in a case so thoroughly searched, so deeply investigated, there were still places left untouched, places where secrets could rest for years, waiting to be found. And now, with her remains finally recovered, detectives were left to ask the hardest question of all. Was this the tragic accident of a woman lost in the woods, or the carefully hidden evidence of a crime? The remains were carefully lifted from the earth, each fragment of bone and fabric placed into evidence bags under the watchful eyes of forensic experts. After 6 long years of silence, the teacher's story had finally re-emerged in the soil of the woods. Yet from the very beginning, investigators understood this recovery would bring as many questions as answers. The bones were transported to the state medical examiner's office, where a full forensic analysis began. Within days, the first confirmation came. DNA testing matched the remains to the missing teacher. The search was over. For her family, that certainty landed like a crushing weight. The word missing could no longer be attached to her name. She was gone, and she had been gone since the very morning she tied her laces and stepped outside. Her clothing was catalogued next. Though weathered and worn, the pieces were consistent with what she had been last seen wearing: a lightweight jacket, athletic leggings, and the running shoes found so eerily intact. The jacket's zipper was still fastened, as though she had been in the middle of her run when her life ended. Time in the forest had claimed the colors, but the form of her outfit told a clear story. This was no body dumped long after the fact. She had been there from the start. Among the personal effects was her watch, its face cracked, its hands frozen in place. Investigators wondered if the time marked on the watch might coincide with her death, though years of exposure made that difficult to confirm. A few other small items, metal fragments from her earrings, the remains of a hair tie, were recovered alongside her. Each was catalogued, each became another piece in a puzzle that refused to align. Soil analysis confirmed what many suspected. The body had been in that location since her disappearance. Layers of sediment and leaf litter enveloped her over the years, sealing her into the ground. This wasn't a secondary disposal site. She hadn't been killed elsewhere and then moved. She had vanished into the forest, and the forest had kept her. But the most disturbing revelations came from her bones. As forensic anthropologists examined the skeleton, they noted irregularities. Some fractures could be explained by natural processes, bones breaking under the weight of soil or from the collapse of branches over time. But others stood out. Several breaks showed characteristics inconsistent with post-mortem damage. The clean edges suggested trauma sustained while she was still alive. One fracture, in particular, drew attention: a break along the side of her skull. The bone showed signs of blunt force impact, though the exact cause could not be identified. It might have been the result of a fall, an accident on the rough terrain where her body was found. But it could also have been something else, something more sinister, like a blow delivered by another person. Her ribs told a similar story. Some fractures could be attributed to decomposition and shifting soil. Others appeared sharper, fresher, as if caused by sudden impact. Forensic experts hesitated to assign definitive causes. After 6 years, too much had been lost to time. But the possibility of violence could not be ruled out. Investigators hoped for clarity, but the evidence left them stranded between explanations. If she had fallen, perhaps she had wandered off the trail, disoriented, and suffered a fatal accident deep in the woods. If she had been attacked, then the fractures might be signs of a struggle, the final violence of an encounter no one witnessed. Both theories fit, yet neither could be proved. The forest, it seemed, had preserved her enough to confirm her fate, but not enough to explain it. Detectives stared at the photographs of her bones, each image a reminder that after 6 years of questions, the answers remained partial. She had not simply walked away. She had not staged her disappearance. She had died in those woods. But how, and at whose hand, remained uncertain. Her family was told the results in measured clinical terms. The official report listed the cause of death as undetermined. For her parents, those words were unbearable. They had waited 6 years for clarity, only to learn that clarity would never fully come. Her husband received the news in silence, his face unreadable. He thanked the investigators, then left without a word, retreating into the solitude that had become his refuge. For the community, the news was both a revelation and a fresh wound. They now knew she had been there all along, hidden in the woods they passed every day. The trail they once avoided became even more haunting. People whispered that perhaps she had tripped, struck her head, and never risen again. Others whispered darker suspicions, that someone had chased her there, silenced her, and left her body in a place too difficult for search teams to reach. The forest had spoken, but only in half-truths. It had given back her body, her clothes, her shoes, her watch, but it had withheld the story of what happened in her final moments. And for detectives, the fractures in her bones were not just evidence of injury. They were fractures in the narrative itself, cracks that left space for every possibility to seep in. The teacher had been found, but her story remained unfinished. And as investigators left the lab with more questions than answers, they knew one thing with certainty: the mystery was not over. With the recovery of her remains, detectives returned to a familiar place, the land of speculation. 6 years earlier, they had exhausted every theory, only to find themselves at dead ends. Now, with her body recovered and the fractures on her bones raising troubling questions, each of those old theories came alive again, this time with new urgency and with sharper edges. The simplest explanation was the one many clung to first. Perhaps she had wandered off the trail, strayed farther into the woods than she realized, and suffered a tragic fall. The terrain near where she was found was brutal. Steep inclines, hidden roots, sudden drops. Even a seasoned jogger could stumble and strike her head. The fracture in her skull could have been from such a fall, the broken ribs from impact. With rocks or branches? To some, this theory provided comfort. It made her death the result of misfortune, not malice. A terrible accident, but nothing more. But others were unwilling to believe it. The idea that she, a creature of habit who ran the same safe loop every morning, would veer so far into unmarked forest-raised doubts. She had been disciplined, methodical, not prone to reckless detours. And besides, the location where she was found was miles from her regular path, through terrain so rough even search teams had once dismissed it as unlikely. What would have compelled her to go there at all? That question fueled a darker theory, that she had not gone willingly. Some detectives began to wonder if she had been lured or chased. If someone had approached her near the park entrance, someone she didn't trust, she might have fled deeper into the woods, away from open spaces, trying to lose them in the thick brush. In that scenario, the fractures could be the result of a struggle or a final act of violence before she collapsed. Rumors spread again through the town, echoing the early days of the case. Neighbors remembered the stories she had told colleagues about feeling watched in the weeks before her disappearance. That detail, largely dismissed at the time, now carried weight. Perhaps she had indeed been stalked, and the morning she vanished had been the moment the stalker struck. Whispers about strangers spotted near the trail resurfaced, each sighting recast in a more sinister light. Others speculated that the person she encountered had not been a stranger at all. They pointed back to her inner circle, her husband, her colleagues, even her students. Had she met someone she trusted on that trail, someone she wouldn't think twice about stopping for? In that case, the absence of immediate signs of struggle made sense. A familiar voice, a casual greeting, a conversation that shifted into something darker. If that theory was true, then her death might not have been an accident at all, but a betrayal. Some detectives considered the possibility that she had been struck deliberately and hidden. The condition of the remains left room for interpretation. Soil analysis showed she had been in that location since the morning she disappeared, but the way her body was partially buried beneath branches and earth raised questions. Had natural processes covered her, or had someone tried to conceal her? The forest had a way of disguising its secrets, but the placement of certain bones, the tangle of roots over her clothing, left investigators uneasy. In the community, The discovery reignited old divisions. Those who had once suspected her husband began to revisit their suspicions, pointing to his withdrawal and silence over the years as evidence of guilt. Others defended him, saying grief explained his reclusion, not involvement. Former colleagues debated the stories she had shared about being followed, some insisting she must have been targeted, others calling it paranoia in hindsight. Every conversation ended the same way, with no agreement, only more doubt. Online forums lit up again, buzzing with theories. Amateur sleuths dissected the fractures in her bones, comparing them to medical case studies, arguing over whether they looked like a fall or an assault. Some even claimed the watch recovered from the scene might hold a clue, that the time frozen on its cracked face marked the moment she was struck. Investigators refused to confirm or deny those claims, but the speculation spread faster than facts ever could. The hardest part for detectives was that none of these theories could be dismissed outright. Each had merit, each was plausible, but none could be proved. Time had stripped away the crucial evidence, leaving only possibilities. Her story had become like the fractured bones themselves, pieces of a whole that no longer fit neatly together. For her family, the renewed speculation was another form of torment. They had waited 6 years for answers, and now they were told the answers might never come. Her mother begged the public to stop guessing, to stop rewriting her daughter's story with every rumor. But the silence left by the investigation demanded to be filled, and people filled it the only way they knew how, with theories. In the end, the discovery changed everything and nothing at once. It confirmed she had died in those woods, but not how, not why, and not at whose hands. Her face still smiled from murals, her story still haunted the trail, but now the weight of her absence was heavier. Theories swirled with new force, pulling everyone into the same endless question. Had she fallen, or had she been taken? In the end, the official report carried just 2 words: cause of death, undetermined. It was the conclusion no one wanted, but the only one the evidence would allow. After months of analysis, after bones and soil and fibers were studied in labs, there was no way to say definitively how she had died. The fractures could have been from a fall or from violence. The placement of her remains could have been natural or intentional. Every possibility remained open, and so the case, at least in the eyes of the law, was closed. For her family, the decision landed with cruel finality. They were given the remains of their daughter, their sister, their wife, in a simple box. 6 years of searching, hoping, pleading, all ended in silence. They planned a burial, one they had long dreaded, yet one they could no longer avoid. Friends gathered at the cemetery on a gray afternoon, heads bowed, the sound of weeping mingling with the rustle of leaves. Her parents clung to each other as the coffin was lowered, her husband standing stiffly beside them, his grief visible in the hard set of his jaw. It was closure only in the most technical sense. They now had a grave to visit, a place to leave flowers, but no peace. What haunted them was not just her absence, but the questions left behind. They had answers to the where, but not the why, not the how, not the who. 6 years of torment had led to discovery, but not resolution. The town felt the weight as well. For so long, the story of her disappearance had been carried like a scar, repeated at vigils, whispered to newcomers, passed between students at the school where she once taught. With her recovery, the story shifted. Now, it was not about a missing person, but about a body found close to home, hidden all those years in the very woods people walked past daily. The silence of that forest was different now. It was not just eerie. It was accusatory, a reminder that she had been there all along, unseen, unrescued. The trail where she had last been seen remained avoided, its entrance marked by faded flowers and candles. Joggers bypassed it, parents warned their children away from it, and even hunters avoided the stretch of trees where her shoes had been unearthed. The woods carried a different kind of presence now, not just the unknown, but the unbearable closeness of her final resting place. Detectives, too, were left unsettled. Though the file was closed, it remained on their desks, reopened late at night by those who couldn't shake it. They admitted privately that the case would never leave them. It wasn't just the tragedy of her death, but the insult to their training. A woman could vanish in daylight, be found years later, and still leave them with nothing but questions. Her story became a cautionary tale, a local legend spoken in lowered tones. Some insisted she had fallen, others whispered she had been chased, still others suggested betrayal from someone she knew. None of it could be proved, and perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all, that the forest, in the end, had given her back, but not her story. Years of grief had ended in a burial, but not in peace. And as the community walked past the woods where her remains had rested for so long, they carried the same thought. What really happened on that morning jog? It was the one question the forest refused to surrender, the one silence that even discovery could not break.